Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Cocktails with a Curator on yet another rainy Wednesday afternoon here in Richmond. For those of you who don't know me, I am Sarah Burgess with the advancement team at VMFA. This week, we are excited to be hearing from Dr. Sarah Eckhardt, who is the Associate Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art here at VMFA. And Sarah is also the curator of the exhibition Working Together, Louis Draper and the Kamoinge Workshop, which is also the topic of our program this evening. On your screen right now, you will see the names of all the sponsors who have generously contributed to this exhibition, and many of you are tuning in to hear from Sarah tonight. So thank you for your support of the exhibition. Thank you for joining us. And as always, thank you to all the members who are tuning in, and your support of the museum means so much. And we've been enjoying spending these afternoons with you. Thank you again to our exhibition sponsors, and cheers to all of you. Glad to have you. And I'll turn it over to you, Sarah.
Thank you. I am going to start by sharing the photograph that we sent out in the invitation. So this is a photograph that Anthony Barboza took of a Kamoinge meeting in the 1970s. He remembers about probably 1972 or 1973. And I thought it made a really nice pairing with Louis Draper's history of Kamoinge that he would have been writing at the same time in 1972 about their earliest meetings. He said, 4 photographers were all that made up the original Kamoinge Workshop. It was 1963. We'd come together in a rather relaxed atmosphere, our Sunday evenings usually consisting of well-blended John Coltrane, Berlanti wine, stewed chicken, bless the ladies, and a dash of photographs. So this photograph really gives you the sense of the friendships and the community that were at the heart of the Kamoinge Workshop. Even though this is 10 years after its founding, you can see the way that that community continued to grow, but really stayed an intimate community. And because this is Cocktails with Curators, and because we were choosing a drink, I thought that red wine was appropriate, given that that was what Louis Draper mentioned in his history of the Kamoinge Workshop, and because it was present in the photograph. And I am going to now turn, I'm going to go back and forth this evening. I'm going to turn to the website. See if I can make this full screen. To tell you tonight about the website that we were able to make in the midst of when we had to close the museum and then the exhibition back in March. We were able to take the Louis Draper exhibition, the Louis Draper and the Kamoinge Workshop exhibition, and we were able to convert it into a website so that people could continue to experience the exhibition even though they, sorry, I'm just adjusting something as I look here. Here we go. So that people could continue to experience the exhibition even as the museum was closed. So one note I'll say at the beginning is, of course, images on a website cannot replace the photographs themselves, because the Kamoinge artists put such incredible emphasis on printing quality, and there's such a beautiful range of tonality, some of which is captured in a photograph online. But I really am so happy that the museum is going to reopen on July 1 to members and July 4 to the public, because the exhibition will be back on view until October 18th, and you'll have the opportunity to go and see these photographs in person, and I really hope that you do. But since we aren't able to be in the museum now, it was really a privilege to get to work with the VMFA team to think quickly on our feet about how to use the resources we had at VMFA on our own collection website, and how to use those to build an online version of the exhibition. And so we really took all of the elements of the exhibition and we put them together into this website. And I encourage you to visit and scroll through. So what I'm going to do tonight is give you about a 15-minute overview on the website and some of the resources that you can see. And then I'm going to switch back over to a PowerPoint, and I'm going to really delve into just one of the portions of the exhibition, the civil rights portion of the exhibition, and look at some of those photographs closely before coming back to Sarah Burgess to answer some questions and hopefully have a lively conversation with you. So I always like to have viewers, when I'm physically in the exhibition space, begin by watching the about 3-minute video that's at the start of the exhibition, because I think the artists' voices are so important, and because this has really been a very collaborative experience working with all of the artists in the Kamoinge Workshop, these early members of the Kamoinge Workshop. So I'll tell you a little bit about the ingredients in the video, the different pieces of footage from different time periods. Then I'm going to play that, and then I'll go on with the website. So between 2017 and 2019, I was able to work with our videographer, Bridget Gansky, and also Sandra Sellers, to conduct video interviews with 9 of the living early Kamoinge members, and to ask them about Kamoinge, what it meant to them, to ask them to talk about their own work, and also to talk about Louis Draper and who he was. And we filmed those, a couple of those interviews both here in Richmond, and then we went to New York to film the rest of those. And one of those members, Sean Walker, in the midst of visiting him many times, he opened his archive up to me, and I was able to look at a lot of his photographs. He found early video footage from 1982 that Carrie Mae Weems had made, the contemporary photographer Carrie Mae Weems, when she interviewed the members in 1982. And she gave us permission to use that footage, which is the only footage we have of Louis Draper. And so we have a chance to hear from him, not just to hear from him, but to hear from him about Kamoinge and what it meant to him in this footage. But also, if there's one question I think I get more than any other question, is how do you pronounce Kamoinge? So different artists actually have slightly different pronunciations of it, but I use Louis Draper's pronunciation from this video. So I am going to hit play and let you watch this with me, and then come back to the website.
We named ourselves the Kamoinge Workshop, and we picked the name from a book by Jomo Kenyatta that is defined as a group of people acting together, and that seemed to be appropriate. So we decided to call ourselves Kamoinge.
You know, to borrow a phrase that I heard somewhere, you know, we were a group that the stars fell on. All the chemistry came together at the right time, and the various things that we needed, you know, we were able to get from each other.
I think these guys, and there's a woman in the group, Ming Smith, are the greatest photographers in the world.
Kamoinge has always been to me a family. You know, it's almost like that's how I grew up. It's almost like that's how I woke up.
For me, it was my way out. So I emerged myself. I went to Lou Draper. Lou Draper had his enlarger on the floor, so we had to print on our knees.
And as I was walking up the street, I saw a photographer. He had a portfolio in his hand and this fancy Chesterfield coat with a fur collar, and it turned out to be Lou Draper.
Lou Draper lived in the building where Langston Hughes lived. So now we got Roy Jacarapa, we got Langston Hughes as mentors of the group.
Kamoinge first introduced photography to me as an art form. That's all I needed, really. Just to know that there was a language, that there was a world.
We all just got together and talked about stuff. And then they said, man, what are we going to do? I said, well, the images that they're doing of us in the newspapers and stuff is terrible. So we decided that we would take that over and photograph our people in a positive way and in a positive light.
The Nationalists is more about the politics. We were more about the culture. We were more about the visualness of Black people.
We had to do more than just take pictures, criticize the pictures, and have shows. We had to take young people and show them that there's a big world out here, Junior, and a camera can bring you much closer to it.
the backbone of what we did was also based on music, based particularly on jazz too.
I'm an instrument in the group. It's not about me, not about power, position, and that's how Lou was also.
The whole thing that held it together, the glue that held it together was Lou Draper, and the kind of mentoring that Lou always did.
Because I wouldn't have done it if it wasn't for Lou, because I really don't do groups well.
So I think when you talk about the Kamoinge Workshop, you have to talk about it in two phases. You have to talk about the actual workshop, the functioning, the day-to-day operation. And then you have to talk about the spirit that was generated by that formative period. And that, I think, will continue with us. I mean, that's such an important part of our lives that there's no way of erasing that.
All right. In addition to that video introduction, all of those clips come from interviews that we did with each of the artists, and those varied from about 1 to 2 hours with lots of detailed stories that were really helpful in my being able to make my way through Louis Draper's own archive and really to piece this entire story together. So I'd also encourage you to go back, and you can see here that there are 10 interviews by the 9 artists, and then 1 interview that are their memories about Louis Draper. And they're each about 4 to 5 minutes long. So they're nice lengths to be able to learn something about them, but not too long. And below that, then we link to the Louis Draper archive. And the archive is really the inspiration for the entire exhibition. So to come back to how this all began, this project started about 8 years ago when Nell Draper Winston brought her brother's photographs to me at the museum to see. And I didn't know who Louis Draper was at that point, and I didn't know about the Kamoinge Workshop. And I had no idea what to expect. But when I opened this, she actually had a rolling suitcase full of his photographs. When she opened that and I began to look through it, I was just overwhelmed by these incredibly powerful photographs. And then I had the opportunity to look at the archive itself. So she ended up working with Gordon Satinius at Candela Gallery. So the archive was here in Richmond. I could go to Candela and I could look at all of these amazing pieces of paper, his writings about Kamoinge. And I learned that he had written really the history of Kamoinge, and that he had been not only one of the founding members, but one of the members who wrote the most about the group's history. And it became clear that this was both a local story, but really a national story that definitely had roots here in Richmond. So I'm just going to show you this link. So if you hit the button here online, it will take you to the Louis Draper archive. And we received a National Endowment for the Humanities grant to digitize the entire archive. And I want to say thank you to Courtney DeCasey, our archivist, who organized all of that. But it was a team of people all working together. Sandra Sellers, Margot Lensmeyer, cataloging and photographing every single piece of paper, and then doing a beautiful job of pairing photographs with contact sheets. So I encourage you also to come back on your own time and really explore the archive. But I'll just share one really encouraging email that Courtney DeCasey got just a couple of weeks ago. A PhD student, a scholar, wrote to ask a specific question and to say that because the libraries are closed right now and her research was completely held up, the Louis Draper archive was what she was using, and it was really important for her as she was pushing her research forward in the midst of everything being shut down. So that was incredibly encouraging and heartening to hear, because that's why we have it here. This is hopefully a resource that teachers and students and scholars are going to use, and it's not just the archive of one photographer, although that's important. It's the archive. It has so many things pertaining to the Kamoinge Workshop as well. So you can come back and explore that. The exhibition also has a portion on the importance of Roy D. Carava, so you can explore the Sweet Flypaper of Life, the book that he collaborated with Langston Hughes to make in 1955, and a book that was very important to the Kamoinge members, who were about 10 to 15 years younger than Roy D. Carava. And then the exhibition really starts around this theme of community. And so we took all of the wall text from the exhibition and we broke them into these sections on the website. And then all of the photographs that are in that section are here on the bottom, and you can scroll through them like this. And then you can hit on a work to enlarge it. And the idea of community is really at the center of the exhibition, because it was not only a community of photographers, but in the 1960s, in the midst of the civil rights movement, this group of African-American photographers decided that they were also going to commit to make images of their community, beautiful, dignified images of their community. And that was, for at least a time period in the 1960s, very much at the center of what they were about. And then we have what you would have found in the cases in the exhibition we have here below. And you can, again, hit on any of these images. It will take you to another page. It takes a minute to load, so I'm not going to do it right now. But what's really interesting is you can see the backs of each of the photographs. So in the exhibition, in a case, you can only see the front. But on the website, you can see the front and you can look at the back. You can see the writing that's on the back. In the case of the 1966 camera portfolio of images that was published on the Kamoinge Workshop in 1966, you can flip through the entire magazine. And this is a magazine that is really rare and hard to come by at this point. And that is actually, this is the magazine that this researcher was writing about, because she was able to see Kamoinge's whole portfolio in one place on our website, and that's because it was in Louis Draper's archive. Another theme that was really important to the Kamoinge members was mentoring youth, especially as they talked about the importance of a truthful representation of their community, because the images that were appearing in the media at the time, they did not feel were truthful. And they not only wanted to make those images, they wanted to teach a younger generation how to make those images, and also to talk about the importance of representation, of visual representation. And I'm going to come back to the civil rights movement in length, so I'm just going to show you quickly how the images scroll through. The global perspective portion was really important, because as the group's name, Kamoinge, which is the Kikuyu word for working together from the Kikuyu people of Kenya, they were thinking about this in 1963 because it was the year of Kenya's independence. And so Jomo Kenyatta, the author of the book Facing Mount Kenya, he had just re-released his book in 1962, and Louis Draper and Al Fanar were reading it, and they found the word Kamoinge in the glossary as they were trying to think of a name to name their group. And so it also helps us to think about the fact that the American civil rights movement was happening at the same time as the sweeping decolonization movement in Africa. And Kamoinge was very aware of these connections. While they weren't traveling as much in the early 1960s, by the late 1960s, and especially by the 1970s, they were making a point of traveling to Senegal, also to countries with significant African diasporas, Cuba, Guyana. So you can see these images here in the global perspective section. And another theme that was really important within Kamoinge was jazz. And it was not just images of jazz musicians, although that was key. Jazz was the soundtrack of the Kamoinge meetings, as many members will tell you. But jazz also had there were a number of words. There's a shared vocabulary between jazz and photography for the Kamoinge members. So they talked about improvisation, they talked about rhythm. These were key elements in street photography. And so is both images like you see here, and we can flip through, Ming Smith's images of Sun Ra, a variety of musicians, as well as the sense of a shared vocabulary. And the final section of photographs is titled Shadows, Reflections, and Abstractions, because as the 60s moved into the 70s, many of the members became increasingly interested in abstraction, although some of the members had been doing abstraction from the beginning. So Al Fanar, for example, had been stationed in Japan in the 1950s. These are his works here. And Japanese art was extremely influential on his own aesthetic, and he shared that with members. And Louis Draper also had been working in an abstract mode since the late 1950s, but there was really a back and forth to how much importance they were giving to abstraction. And you can see that play out then in these beautiful, also shadow images that many of the members were making of each other in the 1970s. If I can get one of those shadow images. So you can see those here. And again, when you go to the website, you can enlarge any of these photos. I'm just giving you a run through so you have a sense of what the website has to offer. And then finally, the final section of the exhibition and then of the website focuses on Kamoinge's legacy and the fact that they really encouraged a whole nother generation of photographers. And they did that through two different modes. One was the Black Photographers Annual. And so Buford Smith, who was a member of the Kamoinge Workshop, he joined in 1965. The group had always had these conversations about the need for a book or a publication, especially because so many African Americans photographers had been denied publication opportunities. They wanted to specifically have a publication for African American photographers. And in 1973, Buford Smith, working with Joe Crawford, was finally able to get the funding to make an absolutely beautiful book, which they then produced for in 1973, 74, 76, and 1980. And Buford has been absolutely wonderful to work with. And he allowed us to digitize those books. So you can read more about the Black Photographers Annual here. You can click the button and then you can actually open the annuals and you can flip through every single page. And again, this is something we keep hearing about from scholars, how incredibly helpful this is as a resource because these books are so hard to find now. And then the group also formed a group called the International Black Photographers. So this was not Kamoinge itself because they had wanted to keep their membership in their sort of their intimate group of 14 artists that they were at that point, but they decided they were at the core of the membership of a much larger group called the International Black Photographers, which through these 4 dinners in the late 1970s that both honored the elder photographers that came before them, like James Van Der Zee, Gordon Parks, Roy DeCarava, but then also was this encouragement to this younger generation of photographers that they wanted to support and they wanted to offer this sense of community. And so we have here all of Tony Barbosa's portraits of these dinners. And then again, you can click on any of these and it will take you to the archive and you can read the newsletter and you can find other related material. And while in a case in the exhibition, you just see the cover of the newsletter, here on the website, you can actually open them and look through them. And then there's a video at the end, since we're closed, which you can click on and you can actually see the physical exhibition in 3-dimension. And then we close with this photo because it was absolutely wonderful that we were able to have these 8 members of Kamoinge come down for the opening at the end of January. It was a wonderful celebration. And finally, there's a list of additional resources at the bottom. So with that, I'm going to come back to the civil rights portion of the exhibition. And I am going to see how well I remember how to switch sharing. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint and I'm just going to talk through a few of these. Here we go. There we go. I'm going to flip through a couple examples just to show of the ways in which we have some works in the archive. that we have a photograph that Louis Draper made, and then we also have the exhibition announcement, which features the photograph. Likewise here, photograph that's the cover of the Camera magazine, photograph that Buford Smith donated. That is actually, you can see here, the photograph that was used on this exhibition announcement. But here we can have the writing on the back. And I just really love this. It's hard to see in the exhibition announcement, but you can see it in the Polaroid itself. There's one member with his back turned, and that was Earl James. And this is always this photograph is a good way to talk about how important membership was for Kamoinge. It was, on the one hand, the group called each other family. On the other hand, they were actually very formal about membership and dues. So you had to get voted into the group, you paid dues on a regular basis, and you needed to attend meetings regularly. So Earl James had been an early member, but he apparently had fallen behind on dues and attendance. And so he participated in the exhibition, but they had him turn his back for the official portrait, and then he was listed as a guest rather than a member of Kamoinge. So again, there's this object, this photograph really tells us something about how there was this tension between how close the friendships were, but how much the Kamoinge Workshop also remained a formal group. So I wanted to turn to the civil rights movement to talk about some of these photographs, because really, the group forming in 1963, they would have resisted, and they still resist, the title of civil rights photographers. Even though they made photographs in the midst of the civil rights movement, what they wanted to contribute instead were photographs by African-American photographers of the African-American community. And so this is a photograph by Herman Howard to show the ways in which the members, some of the members, were attending protests. This is the March on Washington in 1963. But at the same time, they were thinking much more broadly about photography and the power of visual representation and the need for that visual representation. And this is one of the photographs, I think, that really provides this link between who Louis Draper was growing up in Richmond and who he was in the Kamoinge Workshop and as a mentor to young people. This is a photograph titled Congressional Gathering, made in 1959. And I think that we can see in it, you can either see sheets hanging on a line, or you can see a reference to the Ku Klux Klan. And you can see here, close up, that actually a fly has landed on a sheet just where the eye would be. But I was trying to understand why he titled it Congressional Gathering. I had some ideas why he would title it Congressional Gathering in 1959. But as an illustration, it's really the archive that we have, Louis Draper's archive, that enabled me to understand how much he was thinking about Congress and literally about representation in Democratic congressional representation, because he wrote out in his college notebook the year before he left Richmond and went to New York to become a photographer, he wrote out all of the names of the chairs of the committees of the 84th Congress, which sounds a little bit dry, but was really important in those years because the Civil Rights Act was coming to the fore. And he wrote out in his notes the importance of the congressional chairs, especially of the Rules Committee. In fact, he traces that out here, in the ability to bring policy to the floor or not and have it to be blocked. And it was in 1956 that he has denoted with Dem here and on these two pages, the leaders of the Southern Manifesto, which was the declaration written by senators and congressmen from the 11 former Confederate states, and it was the response against Brown versus Board of Education. And so with a photograph like Congressional Gathering, we can have ideas about what that photograph is about. But when we have Louis Draper's notes and we know that he was thinking very carefully about Congress and representation, so much so that he was about to write a paper, and he's written, title of paper, Satan Wears a Confederate Suit. He was thinking very clearly about congressional representation, just as he makes this switch and decides to become a photographer and puts an emphasis on visual representation. And I think that shift is really key. And I think it's key within the conversations of the Kamoinge Workshop. And so this photograph by Anthony Barboza is in the civil rights portion of the exhibition because of the way, especially that Tony talks about this photograph. He made it in 1966. He had been one of the youngest members to join Kamoinge in 1963. And he then was drafted shortly thereafter and was stationed in Pensacola. And he talked about how he could not have made this photograph. He couldn't have seen it if it hadn't have been for Kamoinge, and specifically not just learning about photography, but how much literature and conversations about philosophy and all of these things were mixed into what Kamoinge was, what their conversations were, so much so that he called it university and he called it college, as did Sean Walker. This was their university and this was their college. And one of the authors that Tony talked about most often was James Baldwin, and that it was Louis Draper and Kamoinge that introduced him to the work of James Baldwin in 1963. So it would have been when The Fire Next Time was coming out. James Baldwin was publishing both fiction and nonfiction pieces from the late 50s and in the early 60s. And this photograph, I couldn't fit everything into the exhibition. This portrait of James Baldwin is a very powerful portrait. We have shown at the museum before. It's not actually a part of the exhibition, but I'm including it here because I want to be able to explain how Tony thought about James Baldwin and then this relationship with Louis Draper. So when Tony photographed James Baldwin in 1975, we know that Louis Draper was there with him, was in fact Tony's studio assistant at the time, which Tony talks about. Louis Draper was his photographic mentor, and yet he also, because Tony very quickly established a very successful studio, Louis Draper was also his assistant from time to time. So Louis Draper was there, present for the photography shoot for James Baldwin. And so this is just another beautiful way in which we find things in the archive. So we had acquired Tony's portrait of James Baldwin, and then we found this photograph, this copy slide in the archive with James Baldwin and Louis Draper together, clearly for that photo shoot. And then James Baldwin went on to write for the Black Photographers Annual. He wrote the introduction in 1976 to the third volume, which was the bicentennial year. And I'm not going to read the entire quote, but he wrote a very powerful quote that I think is important given the number of photographs that the members of the collective made of flags. And there's a lot of back and forth, a certain tension around the American flag and a number of Kamoinge's images. So again, this is written in the centennial year, and James Baldwin wrote, speaking specifically about photographs, some of them Kamoinge's photographs, in the Black Photographers Annual volume that he was introducing. He said, "But I have no real interest in America's birthday, since I no longer expect Americans to grow up. Americans have themselves made the date irrelevant precisely by their avoidance of the testimony here recorded, and by their inability to face the truth concerning themselves and that history which has made and makes the lives of all Black and non-white people so dangerous and so hard." And some of the images that I think fit with this quote includes Ming Smith's image, American Seen Through Stars and Stripes. She made this in the bicentennial year in 1976. And so you can imagine the flags that were everywhere when she was making street photographs. You would have seen them in storefronts all over the place. But when she talks about this image, she talks about how this subject, a person she didn't know, this was a person on the street, reminded her of her own grandmother, and how her grandmother would not tell her about the painful experiences she had, but she would instead say, if you had seen what I have seen. And for Ming, this photograph captures that to her grandmother's experience of America that was painful, and yet that Ming didn't have access to because her grandmother wouldn't talk about it. So again, similar images. I'll speed up to make sure that we have some time for questions. This is Tony's image. Also, all kinds of photographic references, because Kamoinge was so completely immersed in going to museum exhibitions, not just of photographers, but also of painters, abstract and Renaissance painters, from Paul Klee on the abstract end to Rembrandt. And so a lot of references that are going on in these. And here I clearly see a reference to Robert Frank's photograph of a flag obscuring a face. And in fact, Herb Randall was able to confirm for me that he knew Louis Draper first, but when he introduced Louis Draper to, when Herb Randall introduced Louis Draper to Al Fanar, so these would have been the three of the very earliest Kamoinge members, they decided to meet up at the Museum of Modern Art in the Robert Frank exhibition that was up at the time. So again, they were constantly going to photography exhibitions. This is Buford Smith's street speaker. This is another photograph that Buford made of Porkchop Davis. So it's a street speaker, but it gives you that sense of the kinds of documents that Kamoinge members were making, Buford was making on the street. This Porkchop Davis stood at that corner for over 2 decades, according to Buford. He was as much a part of the street as anything. And so it's also images that are extremely personal and a part of their lived experience. And I brought up Rembrandt. This image that Louis Draper made of Malcolm X, I think, is very different from other images of Malcolm X we've seen, specifically because Louis Draper was thinking about Rembrandt and chiaroscuro, and he was studying these techniques of, he was looking at painters as he was thinking about photography when he made this image of Malcolm X. This is Adric Cowens looking down at a speech happening in Harlem by Malcolm X. And again, I think of photographers like Cortege, who often made these images looking down. And his haunting image, Adric Cowens' haunting image of Betty Shabazz at Malcolm's funeral. And you can just see through her veil a tear. Which likewise, this Draper is making a reference here to Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, but not through a direct image of crowds here, but instead through this juxtaposition of an image within an image. And this is Buford Smith's image of a man he made at night, and this would have been days after Martin Luther King's assassination in 1968, and this was part of a larger essay that he produced. Again, this is Buford really making images from a completely different perspective and angle. This is Mr. Michaud's bookstore, which was an absolute, it was a famous bookstore and very much a part of the fabric of Harlem and something that Buford walked by all the time. And there are many photographs that are made of this, but they're often show you the whole front of the bookstore, where they show you speakers in front, but instead Buford gives us this very intimate image of this woman, and you have which have a much more intimate and personal perspective on this store, on this important bookshop. This is Albert Fanar talking about the way that Nation of Islam also was very much about a Harlem at the time, and these newspapers were on sale. Again, Louis Draper capturing this tension between the police and some members of Nation of Islam on the street. You can listen to Sean in the videos talk about this photograph here, but again, this gets at street photography and all of the improvisation and the chance that is a part of a photograph, but the keen eye you need to bring all of those things together at that right instant. So Sean was interested in the title of it was Foremost Market, having foremost as a metaphor then for the police officers who are standing here below, because he described them as the foremost threat in Harlem. Constant play of images within images. So you can also see as we're moving forward in the civil rights movement, this is an Angela Davis rally in the early 1970s. Again, Louis Draper capturing, a couple people have said that it took them a couple takes in the exhibition to understand why this photograph was in the civil rights section, and it's because of this. You can read the headline here, Noisy Panthers Disrupt Trial. So this is Louis Draper absolutely paying attention, always very aware of words and how they played out in relationship to humans in photographs, from billboards to a headline on a newspaper. And this is Danny Dawson's photograph of Kenneth Allen Gibson's victory as mayor. He became the first African-American mayor of Newark, New Jersey, and I believe the first African-American mayor of a city in the Northeast on that night. And I included this photograph, again, something that people is difficult to understand on a first glance why this photograph was in the civil rights section as opposed to another section, but I think it's very important in the civil rights section because Herbert Randall was the only member of Kamoinge to go south in the midst of the civil rights movement in 1964. He went to Hattiesburg, Mississippi, but as he makes clear also in his artist video, if you go back to watch that, he had won an artist fellowship, Whitney Hayes fellowship that year, and he decided to use that fellowship to go with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to Mississippi to make photographs. And it was important to him that he was going on a fellowship and that he was independent and that he wasn't a member of SNCC because he didn't want to take orders on the kinds of photographs he was going to make. He made very clear he did not want to make images, violent images in which African Americans were the victim of violence and lacked agency. Instead, he wanted to make images of the African American community itself on their own terms, like you see in this image here of this young boy. But when I was writing about this and I talked to Herb about it, I had said he didn't make images of violence. And he said, unfortunately, that's not true. I made images of violence because I was there and I witnessed it, but I didn't want to publish those images. Those were not the images that I wanted to circulate. Although this is one of the few images that was circulated because Rabbi Arthur Lelyveld had become his friend and asked him to make this image as a document of what happened when he was beaten in the midst of trying to register voters. So he made these images, but the images that he wanted to emphasize were images of the children and the people in the community, and they really could have gone in either place in the civil rights movement section or in the community section, but I thought it was important to put them in the civil rights section to make that point that they were made very much in that context, and this was very much not just Herb Randall's ethos, but really the ethos of the Kamoinge Workshop. And then I wanted to make a point quickly at the end about the ways that media work. So in the civil rights section, we have a couple of magazines, and I'm just going to quickly contrast them. So one, this is Roy DeCarava's portrait he made after the Harlem riots. And you can see Sean Walker, Ray Francis, and Louis Draper. And you can see here this quote about the setup. But what they didn't have control over was the headline on the Newsweek, which says Harlem hatred in the streets, which was really absurd, especially when you hear Ray Francis talk about where he was the night that the riots broke out. He was walking home from playing chess at Columbia University. It's the furthest thing from hatred in the streets, and yet this is the narrative that Newsweek wanted to tell and to put over their portraits, and I think that's important to contrast against then a magazine like Essence magazine. So this is Louis Draper's photograph of Fannie Lou Hamer, who was so important in voter registration drives in the South and was an activist. This is his portrait then that is published with her own interview in Essence magazine in 1971. And so there's a conscious decision that he and a number of the Kamoinge members make to publish their work in Black-owned publications where they have much more control of the narrative that's being associated with their photographs. And finally, I want to close coming back to Nell Draper Winston, who was Louis Draper's sister, is Louis Draper's sister, because she was, she is a civil rights hero here in Richmond in her own right. She was absolutely a part of the sit-ins and the boycotts that happened in 1960 that ended up desegregating the stores on Broad Street. But also, and you can read more about that here in this project, Growing Up in Civil Rights Richmond, which was at University of Richmond. And there's a catalog that goes with this is Brian Palmer's portrait of her. And it was Laura Browder who did the oral histories and Ashley Kistler, who was the curator for the exhibition. And you can actually download the whole book. But in addition to that, her own civil rights history, I think that her preservation of her brother's work and her desire for it to come to the VMFA and for her brother to be better known here, and especially her desire that we would do, that we would work with the youth here in Richmond so that Louis Draper's name would be better known. I think all of that is a part of the work that she has done. So with that, I'm going to return to Sarah and see whether we have any questions.
Thanks, Sarah. That is wonderful. We do indeed have some questions, so let's just jump right in. Going back to the online resource and the archive for a minute, someone has asked if we know how many people have taken advantage of the online resource.
That's a great question. I don't know. I can ask Courtney DeCasey and find out. I don't know right now how many people, but that is, let's just say a lot.
Yeah, a lot.
I don't have a number.
About that PhD student that found it to be incredibly helpful, and so we know that people are taking advantage of it, and that's great. And I know we don't have Courtney or any of the many other people that helped with this process, but could you talk a little bit about the process of digitizing the archives and about how long that's taken and what's involved with that?
Yes, I would be delighted to. We actually did it on a really fast timeline, believe it or not. The grant was over an 18-month period, which is really fast. There were, oh gosh, now I need to have my numbers in mind, but I think we have something like 5,600 objects, but that doesn't count like how many pages are in a magazine or in a notebook, or how many images are on a contact sheet. So when you talk about images, there are 50,000 images. And we tried to look at every single image on every single contact sheet to identify dates, what people were in which contact sheets. And that was a much bigger project. So Courtney DeCasey's head of archives, Margot Lentz-Meyer, was working closely with her on cataloging, Sandra Sellers then. So Margot would catalog, Sandra, she would hand it off to Sandra. Sandra would photograph it and make sure that the numbers is really, this is where I wish I had Courtney Casey here to describe their brilliant numbering system in the way that only an archivist could describe a numbering system. But they came up with a numbering system that allowed them to associate a print with a contact sheet with a negative. And I don't know of another archive that has been so thoroughly documented and put online and organized in a way that people can put all of that together. So I think it was pretty groundbreaking and really fast. So one of the difficulties actually, and I'll get the book here, in producing the book to go with it is that we were still finishing cataloging and digitizing the archive as I was writing, and I would think I would have the narrative down, and then we'd find something else. And I would feel like I had another, poor Sally Curran, the editor, I'd feel like I had another 2 pages, 3 pages, I gotta add. Because we were just trying to comprehend what we were finding, and then I would call one of the artists. And that was another wonderful part of this process. I would send a contact sheet, I'd email one to Tony Barboza or to Herb Robinson or Sean Walker, and they would, and Buford Smith, they would tell us what was in them, but then also they would contribute things from their own archives to help us tell the story. And it was really phenomenal process, and I could not have done it without them.
Yes, definitely a team effort. We have a few questions about Lou's history in Richmond. How much we know from Nell, or from the materials that Nell gave us in the archives, how much we know about his history, and what kind of art education he may have received in Henrico County schools.
Sure. Yes, so he was born in Henrico County. He grew up in Bungalow City, which was a neighborhood really outside of Highland Springs. Schools were segregated, so he attended a African-American school, but the facilities were in really bad condition. They still had a wood-burning stove. So Nell, there's more, you can read more of that story in the catalog, because Nell really told me a lot of the details about that, about growing up there. And so their mother made the decision while their father actually was drafted for World War II. So in the midst of World War II, while their father was away, she made the decision to send them to a private Catholic school here in Richmond, Vandeviver School, which is in Jackson Ward. So they took the bus there and had quite a long commute. And they both went there through middle school before they then went to Virginia Randolph High School in Henrico. So according to Nell, Lou was not interested in art at all in high school, even though his dad was an amateur photographer and wanted him to be interested in photography. She says all he wanted to do was play baseball and basketball. And baseball was a very important part of their life, their family life too. But it was in college at Virginia State that he came to photography, because he wanted to be a journalist. So he was writing for the school newspaper. And then when his dad found that out, he sent him a camera. He started making photographs for the paper. And then he discovered The Family of Man, the book, lying in his dorm room. He doesn't know who gave it to him. And that was the thing that clicked. So he'd been using a camera, but he saw The Family of Man in 1955, 56. It came out in 55, he saw it in 56, and that changed everything for him, because he saw these photographs as these very powerful things, and he wanted to learn how to make those kinds of photographs. Leaves Richmond and goes to New York, and his photography education really comes from photographers that mentor him in New York. So that would be Eugene Smith would be one of the primary photographers, who was basically regarded as one of the greatest Life magazine photographers, photojournalists of the day. And so much I could go into, but talking about the research, I want to give credit to Shreya Cochran, who was the research assistant for this project. And I should have talked about her as part of the NEH grant. She was one of the people going through all that material. She learned about the Jazz Loft project, which was the cataloging of all of the tapes. Eugene Smith was a little bit, he was a unique person. He was filming constantly. He was recording, audio recording in his studios constantly. So thousands upon hours, and he had all these photographers and jazz musicians coming through his studio. And so it took one person 8 years to type all of the things they heard in his studio. And Shreya went through that finding aid, found 50 hours worth that had Louis Draper in them. And we have these beautiful quotes of Eugene Smith talking about how talented Louis Draper was, as well as conversations he was having with Louis Draper. And so I would say that probably the most significant part of his photography education came from working in Eugene Smith's studio. And Eugene Smith had famously high printing standards, and Louis Draper became one of his printers. And so a lot of the Kamoinge members talk about how Louis Draper taught them how to print, and that he printed in Eugene Smith's style. There's a long answer.
Thank you. Let's see, one more question related to the website and archive. You mentioned that something that was part of Nell's reason for giving us this material is being able to, educate people in Richmond about her brother. Have we made an effort to share, perhaps not the new resource yet, but the website and the archive with local schools?
That's a great question. And yes, I think that our education department always does such a good job in working with teachers to make our resources available. And the other thing, that one of the things that was really sad, that one of our programs that was canceled because of the coronavirus was, I was going to have a conversation with Nell Draper Winston here. I say here in Churchill because I'm close to the Robinson Theater, and we were going to have a conversation in the Robinson Theater. And Nell remembers very fondly that their aunt's house was across the street from the Robinson Theater, and they used to lie on the floor at the window and look through their own window. And when their other aunt on their dad's side was an usher, would open the door, they could watch the Robinson Theater movies from window to window, or from window to door. And now, really, even though they grew up in Henrico County, they spend a lot of time on their weekends with family in Churchill. And so that was one of the ways we wanted to connect with the community where they both grew up. So we'll keep thinking about how to do that in the midst of the coronavirus, because I think that's such an important, I think that bringing this project to the community is a really important part of the project. But I would say the other thing we did was we had our Museum Leaders in Training program, which is our teen program. We do that every fall, and they take the students, the teens, take on a different project that introduces them to different aspects of the museum behind the scenes. And so that project was focused on Louis Draper and the Kamoinge project. So they came up with their own timeline, and they interviewed Nell, and it was a beautiful interview. They did such a good job, and we filmed that. So that's an additional resource made by the teams on the website, which you can access if you go to the Louis Draper. If you go to the exhibition homepage and you scroll down, you can access the Museum Leaders in Training resource that the teens made, which was very much to honor Nell's desire that Lou would be better known here.
Definitely. You mentioned, you showed us some examples of exhibition cards from early exhibitions of the group in New York. Mm-hmm. And you also mentioned a few artists receiving fellowships. Can you talk a little bit about which institutions were supporting?
Yeah. Oh goodness. I need to get my
galleries, and
I need to get my footnotes back on. So, okay, I would say that the libraries in Harlem, specifically the County Colon Library, was a really crucial place for photographers to show their work. But then also Langston Hughes, whole other thing I could have gone into, Louis Draper was renting a room in Langston Hughes' building and was close to him. And Langston Hughes was friends with the founder, whose name I'm going to forget right now, of the Marketplace Gallery. But Langston Hughes made it a point of really supporting younger groups. And so he was very supportive of Kamoinge, and may have been, we think, the connection that helps them get the space, the gallery space at Marketplace Gallery. This is a good question. I totally forgot to talk about this. So in 1964 and 1965, the Kamoinge Workshop held exhibitions and really had a gallery in Harlem in the Marketplace Gallery. So that was their own, they were funding that, and then they printed their own portfolios, which again, you can see online, and they were selling those at, I think, $15 a portfolio, which is $1 a print. There are 15 prints inside, so they were very reasonably priced. And then in the late 1960s, a lot more federal grant money became available for art groups, and they were pretty regularly in the 1960s applying for grant money and getting into various exhibitions. And I do think that's important to think about when I look at how they did in the 1960s, and then they had two significant shows in the 70s at the ICP, International Center for Photography, and at the Studio Museum in Harlem. It would take a lot to trace all of the funding, but I think there was more federal grant money for galleries. And that money, those grants, there were far less available in the 80s. And so when I was listening to tapes of meetings that Sean Walker sent me, I thought it was really interesting. On the one hand, we say that they were less active in the 80s because their own personal careers took off, but it was also clear that they were still getting together to look for grants in the 80s, and they just weren't, there wasn't the same amount of funding for the arts in that time period. So I do think it's important to remember how important that is to supporting groups, like funding is to supporting art groups. So that was a great question.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we are past 6 o'clock, so I'll just wrap up with one last question. And somebody has asked where the exhibition will be going after it leaves the MFA.
Good question. Yes, thank you. Nice. It will go to the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York in November. And then a year and a half from then, it will go, the dates are a little bit fluid because of the coronavirus and various institutions' exhibition schedules, but it will go to the Getty in Los Angeles, and it will go to the Cincinnati Art Museum in Ohio. So that will be and we're grateful that all of those venues are still on, and the schedules just changed. And I think we were really fortunate, though it's worked out well.
Yes, and one person just asked again when it's closing at the MFA, which is October 18th, and we were lucky that that all worked out to be able to extend it here and then still have it visit those other institutions afterwards.
Yeah, great.
So,
I'm sorry I can't see everybody's face. I miss you all. I don't know who you all are, but I miss seeing you.
So thank you on that note, everyone, for tuning in. Yes, cheers to all of you.
Thank you for all your work setting it up.
Well, cheers. Until next time.
All right.